at Sacred Buttons, and today I'm going to be interviewing a peyote conservationist. He's a nice gentleman by the name of Leonardo Mercado, and he is the Cultivation Director and Liaison at Morning Star Conservancy. So how you doing today?
Good.
Good, that's good. So I just got a few questions for you about your organization. So tell me a bit about yourself and your organization.
Well, let's see. I'm a native of Southern Arizona, grew up in the Sonoran Desert, quite actually in the saguaro cactus forests. So you have these giant, iconic, 20 to 40 foot tall, massive cacti growing everywhere. And oddly enough, I loved it, but I didn't realize how fantastic it was till I got older. I'm like, wait a minute. I grew up in this place where it's just like another planet of cacti that you can't even believe one of them. And yet you look around and there's hundreds of thousands coating the hills. So it's just a weird, kind of magical vibe about that. And it eventually ended up my falling in love with desert plants, just 100%. That's my most fun hobby is, wandering around in the desert, looking at plants, learning more about them, visiting collections, going to museums, having to do with desert ecology, I guess is what I would say. And I was raised, Catholic in a Mexican family, spoke Spanish as first language here in the Southwest. My grandparents were very knowledgeable about traditional plant medicines, etc. But I didn't have a peyote lineage that I could tell in my background. But I did have this inclination from my Catholic upbringing to like wonder about God and stuff, and then, the whole Santa Claus thing, you're like, wait, if that's being told to me like that, maybe the bigger questions need to be looked at here, what am I being sold as, like, I guess what people would refer to as faith or something like that. And I guess, you could almost say a little skepticism, but there was this weird concept in my background culture of that there was this cactus that people used in ceremonies to worship, to pray. And I thought, well, that's got to be something interesting, but I never really went there as a kid. I was just growing up in this fantastic desert playing around in it. And then at some point, when I saw a picture of what this cactus looked like, I was fascinated by the look, I guess, And you know what I'm saying? I see your t-shirt, there's a certain beauty to it, simplicity. They all look the same, but they're all different, kind of like people. And there was just
Absolutely, yeah.
something about it that I was just like, what? I want to find that. I want to see that. And so I think it was around 18, I started traveling when I got my first real job. I started taking my vacations down to run in the Chihuahuan Desert and the Tamaulipan scrub, however possible. So that was in the 70s, mid to late 70s. My interest in the plant developed. And boy, just first time seeing it, I knew it was like God's Easter eggs. And, because you're like hunting around and maybe find one, but there's probably more. And it's just that whole exciting feeling. They're the opposite of a saguaro, where the saguaros are obvious. And if you were driving down the road and you didn't see any, you'd miss them. You'd be like, where's all the saguaros? But there's so many that you're driving by that you almost have to stop looking or noticing. Anyway, that's the thing about this peyote is it's like so subtle that it kind of has to be looked for and found, or even more accurately, sought after and listened to. So, you can find it. So it becomes possible. Such a, like I say, almost like an Easter egg. They're not everywhere, but they're out there, and it's just this vibe when I would go in that desert. So I was pretty young, not 20 yet, and I was doing this running around. So that's kind of like the about me and how it developed into Morning Star Conservancy was because over the decades, I witnessed the changes in its native habitat and a huge conversion is the word they use of the ecology. Uh, Back in the day, it seemed like it was mostly about agriculture. It started with onions and things in the Rio Grande Valley. It's good soil for growing things, but that's mostly in the valley. But then it was discovered because of the climate, humidity, and everything that you could make the most money apparently by converting huge tracts of land to grazing land. So what they would do would be rip up the soil and all the plants with these plows, chains. They have scrapers that they use to do this that dig down like a foot and just turn over the top. And they would just pile all the debris up, and usually burn it or something and plant grasses like, non-native grasses like buffalo grass, which has become a problem in the West as well. Um, So these large tracts were no longer habitat for these rare cacti, these awesome, beautiful species of all sorts. It's not just peyote. There's quite a few things growing under the nurse plants, the larger bushes and trees that get wiped out and can't rewild themselves because there's no longer any seed sources to produce any new growth. It literally eliminates certain species, especially peyote and its relatives, off the landscape. Well, eventually it seemed like, the oil rigs and oil operations were taken out a lot. These days, I think the fastest growing problem we see is actually green energy, believe it or not. It's like solar fields, panels, and wind farms. And you wouldn't think like a wind farm takes up a large footprint, but it does. There's a lot of roads involved, a lot of clearing, not just the footprint itself, of the windmills themselves.
Yeah.
So we've seen this, and now I couldn't do this in the 70s, but now you can get on Google Earth or Google Maps, get the satellite view, and literally see what it looks like from above. So you just see strips of native desert left in South Texas, just strips. Um, or you see large tracts that were converted 50 years ago and you can still tell
Yeah.
because it's not quite the greenery and the lushness of the natural desert as it would be. So we can see this, but I've seen this in terms of the plants themselves, which is what we're talking about here, that it's a species that only grows a little north of the border into the United States in southern Texas along the Rio Grande, first of all. And so that is its only harvestable region for purposes of the Native American Church in the United States and Canada. Um, so that's a small area to be relying on. Most of the peyote is growing south of the Rio Grande in Mexico that could be harvested. But about 60 years ago, there was a distribution system set up for the Native American Church through the federal government, basically the DEA, and these days, the Texas Department of Public Safety. And that disallows any import from south of the border. So you're relying on that small northern population, first of all. And you've got this land conversion going on everywhere, which is way out competing the peyotero's ability to find desert where there's still peyote growing as the years go by. The problem with this distribution system, for many years, have called it a legal bias towards extinction because there are no provisions for seed gathering, for planting, even for salvaging plants that are about to get bulldozed by the tens of thousands in some cases. It's against the law to do anything with those plants but destroy them.
Yeah. It's a real shame.
And a lot of other species of cacti even have a lot more protection than the peyote itself because there's this distribution system. Now, I'm not trying to say there shouldn't be a distribution system, but there should be one that takes some note of the reality of the species itself and the ecology from which we're extracting it from. And it is an extraction. We're just literally extracting as much peyote as we can. So over the years, I saw the average size of the medicine that was sold for the Native American church use going from granddaddies, grandmothers, nice fatties. Fast forward to today, smallies, sometimes a whole sack that may not even have flowered yet,
Yeah.
if much at all. So those sacks back in the day, you know how I was saying they grew a lot of onions down there? Well, there were a lot of onion sacks around, these big, netted nylon onion sacks that you can buy bulk onions in and ship them. Well, those sacks would be filled with these peyotes, and it would be a full onion sack to make up 1,000, which is generally the units they're sold in, 1,000 at a time. All the racks that they sort them and dry them in and keep them in are 1,000 racks and etc. So you could barely carry one of these sacks when I was a kid. And now you can buy the same number unit of 1,000 and carry out a half a grocery sack under your arm, and that's 1,000. So there's numbers involved, but there's also mass. The more time that goes on and the smaller the average peyote that's sold to the Native American church gets, the more they have to equal the same amount. That makes sense.
Yeah, for sure. And how does that affect the potency of the medicine being smaller?
Well, that's the thing, maybe, but it's not really accepted as such among the crowd I run in. There's a lot of, guess what you would call teepee urban legend about the small ones being stronger, So it's hard to say realistically. I was just happening to listen to a podcast with Keeper Trout this morning and Joey Santori in which they were discussing this. And, I think it's generally accepted that the less time they've had to grow, the less alkaloids they have overall.
It would make
So,
sense, yeah.
so the big ones definitely seem, to an experienced eater like myself, going down to Mexico and finding these old ancient plants, you eat one of those, there's a lot of bitter. So if that results in anything, it's probably a fact that the older ones, you also require less in a ceremony, generally speaking. Although
Okay.
I'm not a big fan of the potency thing for ceremonial use, it's almost like two different things to me. Like on the ceremonial level, that's not even an issue. Um, uh, it's not an experienced effect that, oh, this peyote is really strong. It's always strong to us because because it serves a ceremonial purpose. It's kind of westerny to think that potency matters, you know. And that's just me speaking as kind of like a reforming hippie. I'm just saying that's not really a thing. But I do understand though that there's a lot of botanical fact here that gets ignored in this distribution process. Potency is one. The whole mass to numbers thing that I was mentioning, it's really about the mass. So if were it properly harvested and they were all allowed to get to the proper size, you'd cut the amount of plants needing to be harvested down by a tenth of a percent or 10%, let's say, just because of the pure mass involved
I also find too
and
with
possibly potency to get to your point.
yeah, yeah. I also find too with the larger ones, they tend to regenerate more readily when harvested properly.
They
Uh,
regenerate quickly because they've got that underground taproot all good to
yeah,
go. It's the young ones that don't have that yet that take more time. Once they're established, it's like a tree. You know, you try cutting down a eucalyptus tree or something like that down here down south,
yeah,
and you look next year, you could barely tell because
yeah,
it's got that mass to create new tree. And it's a lot like that with the peyote as well. So that actuality that we literally saw over the years. There's other factors. Let's just say, economics is always a big factor. Um, the price went from that huge sack you could just hardly carry to the car. Went from like 110 when I was first around the neighborhoods down there,
mhm,
to these days. Well, I don't even want to say, but let's just say it's at least 6 times as much.
yeah,
So you're talking it's getting over halfway to $1,000. And not that I feel like that's necessarily a bad thing. I think it ought to be twice as much for the situation that it finds itself in. But there needs to be a plan to regenerate at the same time and allow some of the income that is naturally produced from this to somehow guarantee that it's not going to be gone in 10 years.
yeah,
Um, there's a lot of realities about that. For example, uh, the economic one is one that everybody notices. So many Native American church chapters are based in, let's just say, economically underprivileged areas. You're not finding wealthy people just saying, oh, so the price is now, 600 and what, 700 and what? Okay. That's not an easy thing to swallow for most people. So on a street level, on a ground level, we notice that. And then you notice that the amount you're getting, they're all little babies. They shouldn't have been cut. A lot of them have their whole stem intact, the underground stem, because they're not even taking the time to slice them. They're just whacking the soil and bringing everything up because economically they're getting paid the same price for every little baby as they would get for this. And that doesn't make sense. You see, there's
yeah,
so many layers to the legal bias towards extinction that it's almost guaranteed to work because there's so many angles, you know, and the wagons are all circled against this species. So, so we saw this, and a group of us, friends and members of the Native American Church, and we see each other in ceremonies often, and we talk afterwards, and we have to procure our sacrament for everyone ahead of time, and sometimes you're talking like a long waiting list, you know. A lot of times, even if you go there in person, you're still talking a long waiting list because it's not just like, the Circle K where you can just pull up, or the Go Mart or anything of peyote. That doesn't exist. And another thing is, obviously, if it's like that, it's hard to be in that business. So now we're down to 2 or 3 licensed dealers at the most, because a lot of that might just be a very part-time gig. And uh, I guess when I first started going down in the late 80s, it was somewhere between 8 and 10. So you could make a living. So we've seen everything pinched down. So this group of friends, we're seeing this clamping down on the actual species, but it's having an effect on our church as well. Um, we started wondering what you could do. We actually pray about it, and this is not uncommon. You go to most Native American church ceremonies, there's going to be some gratitude expressed for the fact that we can still even have this and how it's going to be in the future. And we've wondered about it. We've prayed about it. And we finally kind of like congealed on like this idea of like, well, let's get something going just to talk about it, just to have a platform where we have a place for people to input, not like necessarily a lot of output. We didn't have a clue of what could be done, but we knew a lot of people who cared. So we figured, let's start actually an organization that can maybe be a clearinghouse of information. And then our pipe dream idea was hopefully to procure land that's designated as sanctuary. The reality is that after many years of looking at it and then formally starting an organization, Morning Star Conservancy, uh, we saw a lot of problems on the landscape, quite literally on the landscape. South Texas, if you read the news, is not the safest place in the world for the last couple of decades, and it's gotten a lot more unsafe just in the last 10 years.
Yeah.
And so I've been wandering down there enough decades to feel the change. Quite literally, there's, I hate to say it, but an oppressive spirit on the land uh, because of that border, and because of every situation that goes along with it, social, economic, uh, profiteering issues of every sort. Um, there's a lot of bad vibe on the land, and it is unsafe. And I mean unsafe is like not just in human terms, but even like the official field survey that was being done by Cactus Conservation Institute a few years back on like harvesting data, trying to keep track of a population, what happens after you harvest it, how it regenerates, what the speed of growth is. Even their plants were poached out over the years, and they had to end the study. What I'm
Yeah.
saying is the security is a huge issue, not just human, but particularly on this species. And it's very
Yeah.
difficult when there's actually a legal market right down the road, because anybody looking for some beer money or whatnot can come upon plants and drive them right down the road and sell them legally, enter them into a legal market. That's something that is not going to be underutilized on the landscape. So it would require some situation where, I'm just saying, just ballparking it here, you need a $10 million property and a $3 million fence to actually, actually, uh, of any size, any property that can make any difference
Yeah.
in a situation, it's just almost undoable.
Yeah.
It would take Elon Musk, you know, to design not just the security fence, but you know, the legality. Even Texas happens to be the least logical state in terms of its actual peyote laws, and that's a little bit, disconcerting too, because that is the one place that there needs to be something established for um, how you say any kind of conservation, not just seed germination and plant salvaging, but like a whole plan and program to regenerate on a larger tract than most people are being able to afford to purchase, no matter what size your organization is. It would almost have to be well, there is talk of a USDA gift to peyote conservation, but there's not a lot of straightforwardness about how you would spend that money and how successful it could actually be. So Morning Star Conservancy looked at this, dealt with it, literally walked the ground, talked with realtors, went out with locals on trips, however it was possible to investigate a situation that seemed fairly dry in terms of possibilities. So over some time, we began to look at the realities, and I bring it up a lot, but it needs to be brought up. There's this old saying which says the best time to plant a fruit tree was 10 years ago. The second best time is today. Because if somebody hadn't planted those fruit trees, there'd be no fruit now, that deal.
Mhm.
And as time goes by and as we get older, it starts really impinging. I'm literally thinking, boy, how many ceremonies do I get to go to? But where's all this coming from, and how is it getting here? And it starts to wear on me, actually. And so it was almost like a frustration. I was raising my kids and having my family, and since those early days when I could just wander the desert down there on my own and investigate. I've still attended many ceremonies. There's a lot going on around the country, both of our countries. And it just makes you wonder. And like I say, it wears on my conscience. So what we eventually refined ourselves as an idea was let's start getting those fruit trees planted now. Even if we don't know where they can permanently live down the road, there's no down the road if there's not something going on.
Yeah.
That's what I started coming up with. I was just like hitting this wall of like, what do you do? So we began to look at the possibility of just starting what I called a pilot project, where you can give an example of how to provide sustainable peyote seedlings for regeneration or for sacramental use. You're looking at a longish term program. You're looking at, 1 to 10 years before a teepee ground could have its own sustainable garden from seed, if they're having any amount of ceremonies throughout the year. But still, it's better than nothing. And just like a fruit tree, it's going to take those years. That's just the way it works. So I started looking at, well, how do you do that? Okay, we set up a pilot program. I've been growing the medicine down here in the Southwest most of my life, 2/3 of my life. So I see, how it can be, but I never had I did have a fairly large garden at one point, which is a whole other story. I had a separate organization which attempted to do that, but it wasn't real popular in the decade I was trying to do it. And I guess it's easier to talk about these days.
Yeah.
And as you know, in Canada, it's quite easy to talk about because it's not illegal to conserve this plant or grow it or collect the seed or trade it or sell it. So as it turns out, our pilot project was in Canada. And, the legality was one of the reasons, but mostly love was the main reason, because I'm in love with a dear lady who I'm fortunate to be married to, who is Canadian. And so between the two of us, we decided to start something because here we are, and we've got this little corner in our house. And, it's like I say, it almost became a responsibility rather than an option. It's just emotionally. I'm like, what are we doing? How do I keep going to ceremony without doing something?
Yeah.
So Morning Star Conservancy, to answer your question, is now in the seedling sanctuary stage of this pilot project, where we started with an example of what could be done almost on a micro level, starting with 1,000, 2,000, however many seeds I could scrape up from my own mother plants was the genesis of this. And we showed that it can be done even in somebody's front room, which it's still happening in our front room in Canada, and has expanded quite a bit and is just growing beautifully, and is now in the stage where it's producing its own seeds. So that didn't take long. That took something like 4 years, just a touch over 4 years to get that self-generating. So we like it. And we're now doing that in the Southwest United States, in Arizona specifically. And Arizona is kind of the opposite of Texas in that it's got a very progressive provision, an exemption from prosecution for criminal possession of peyote, by saying that it is not criminal possession for this plant to be possessed for religious or spiritual purposes, period. And that basically is the period. There is no other thing to it except for that it shall be not opposed to public safety, welfare, or morals, I believe it says. So in Arizona, we are squeaky clean with Arizona law. And on a federal level, we just deal with how we deal with it every day in the Native American Church, which is we're members of the Native American Church, and we practice our services, um, and that requires custodianship. In other words, we need to have a supply of the medicine in our community at all times for upcoming ceremonials, or, a lot of these ceremonies aren't planned. They're emergencies, they're medical situations, they're bereavement, uh, they're things that come up in one's life.
Yeah.
So that is the status of Morning Star Conservancy, is that we're just moving on to being able to provide a working example. We're starting workshops for Native American church groups uh, coming up right at the beginning of the new year. We're starting with our first workshops here on our facility, where visitors will be able to come and see the process of starting from seed gathering, by the way, on our mother plants, the process of planting them, doing that whole midwife stage that you're probably well aware of, where you've got these little babies, for the first 6 to 9 months that require just a little bit of extra, tenderness,
For sure.
basically.
Yeah.
But once they're past that, then you've got that transplanting stage where all of a sudden they just really kick to it.
Mhm.
They really go from this little tiny nothing to really something before the end of the first year even comes up, if you do it right.
Yep.
And so we've got those stages going on to show, but also all the in between of how then they're allowed to go either into a controlled environment, depending on where you live and where your Native American Church chapter is located, your teepee grounds, uh, or like we have here in the Sonoran Desert, where they can actually be put out in natural culture. And that is basically under the creosote, under the mesquite trees, under the desert nurse plants that are very typical of where they grow in their native grounds in Texas and Mexico. Almost indistinguishable in terms of the plants and the geology of the area.
Nice.
So we kind of, I guess I'm saying, in some way, we gave up on native habitat restoration for now. But thankfully, there are other groups looking at that specifically. It's just that these other groups aren't focused on where the uh, gene stock is going to come from for the future. Right now, we're trying to focus on seeds from that area where it's most decimated, by the way. We have different locality sources for our seeds just because we can, and we do. But the area that's most taken out, from extraction is really where we'd like to have the most seeds from, which kind of makes sense. But they're also harder to get in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
So that's what we're looking at, is like potential rewilding in native habitat down the road. Hopefully when, different groups, I don't really care who it is. I say, come on in, Elon,
Yeah.
or come on in, USDA. I don't really care at this point who it is that manages to preserve some ground down there. There is hope. There are a few groups.
Yes.
There's at least two, and I would say 2.5 that we know of, that are getting quite serious about the situation and are acquiring land if haven't already done so.
Yeah.
And I say 2.5 because one of them is quite actually in the formation period, but they're real fired up, real knowledgeable, and people are starting to pay attention. So Morning Star Conservancy is one of those, and just somebody needs to do it. A lot of somebody's need to do it.
For sure. For sure. So I guess that kind of leads into my next question is, what is the ultimate goal of your organization?
Well, peace on earth and goodwill to all species, maybe, because that peyote habitat has a lot of things that have been poached out already. Peyote is just the one of them. And it's not just cacti, it's not just plants, there's a lot of mammals involved here and whatnot. I think that land protection in these extremely endangered environments is something that's getting awoken to and should be standard issue. Just to bring Elon back into this one more time, they're building this gigafactory just across the border into Mexico, uh, in Tamaulipas, which is awesome peyote habitat, but also threatened because of its proximity to the border and the human activity there. Um, when I first heard about that, I was like, well, there you go. It's just another giant plant where land is going to get scraped to put the thing in, and that's it for that area.
Yeah.
Whatever peyote is there is now gone. Thanks, Elon. It was about a month or two after I heard about that I happened to read down to the last paragraph of a random article about it. And thankfully, because in that last paragraph, I noticed how there was an environmental screening program for species protection. And I think it was like the last species mentioned in the list that they were looking at specifically was peyote. And I was like, yeah, okay. I mean, that's just like a seed, that's a start. It's almost like a token gesture. But nonetheless, you would think we would get our act together here in the States for this endangered species, threatened species, with significant cultural significance, like it is extremely valuable on a non-economic level. And by the way, I need to mention this. When you say the goals, yeah, it's really the habitat, but there is this anthropocentric need. In other words, humans desire this plant. And depending on who you talk to, they'll say, we need this plant. See? So there is that. But I do want to say I distinguish that from the larger issue, which is the ecological degradation and loss. To me, that's larger because if that's gone, well, that whole cultural thing is gone too. That whole need you have for this plant is gone too. So it seems like our goal is to make sure that there's a sustainable supply in the future for practitioners of the peyote way, for sure. But that's like embedded in that bigger problem. Like, where's all this coming from? And that's why we went back to the seed, because to me that seems like, hey, that's where it all comes from, in terms of even lettuce. We get so used to buying the lettuce at the store, and how many times do we think about that little tiny lettuce seed? They're so tiny, just like that, and they fly off. But if it wasn't for that seed and somebody taking care of it, up to this point, we've been habituated to this just comes from the desert, man. It's just where it comes from. Like, don't worry about it. You can still, uh, technically, we don't even have to go down there. We can just make the order and, pay for it electronically, basically, and then it comes through the postal service. So there actually is a heck of a lot of disattachment to the reality of where this is coming from for just a lot of us. It's habituation. It's been that way for 50, 60 years. You get used to it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I guess what I'm saying is, yeah, there's the need for ceremonial use of peyote. But I guess ideally, I'd like to see the plants that are cultivated for conservatory purposes ultimately end up on the land somewhere and not cut, and provide some medicine for Native American church use as well. So it's like kind of two things in a way, one bigger and one smaller, but also very important.
Yeah. And I like the idea of the workshops that you said there, because I'm a big believer that the spread of the cultivation information is very important as well. It needs to be out there to, help to keep it alive, right? The more people who are aware of the methods of cultivation, the better, right?
Well, that's what we say. There's a lot of people who would say not. And then you're just talking about, I guess, what we would call politics. but a lot of these politics are also based on, you know, beliefs and I guess religious sentiments. So we wouldn't be covering the whole issue if I didn't mention that. Like there are, I just read one just this morning, because I get this, news alert, peyote news alert on Google or whatever. And so just this morning, the one I saw, which is it's not new to me, but I just happened to see a newly published article about it was a high up in the Navajo Nation. I'm not sure if it's their new president or not. It could be, uh, but signed some kind of decree of some sort saying, "Hey, we're not down with peyote being included in any decriminalizational law." I.e., there's a large group among certain Native American church affiliations or individuals even that do not agree that the more people who know how to grow this plant, who have the seed and take the time to do that and cultivate it, they don't agree with that. So I acknowledge them and their beliefs. I don't agree with all that. There's a lot of reasons why. Mostly it's about the math, because my thing is, how does prohibiting the cultivation of peyote equal having less peyote in the world? I don't really believe that that math works. So it's
Yeah.
very simple for me.
Yeah.
And I tend to not, whatever somebody wants to believe is fine. But what I believe is that cultivation of peyote is a religious act. For me, it is. And for a lot of other people, it is. Whatever you want to call a religious act. But, quite literally, it involves a lot of kneeling on my part, kneeling on the ground and you're getting in there and you're tending a living thing from a little tiny seed to something that you can plant out and get on your knees and plant. That is to me, that's like my uh, kneeling to Mecca, in my own way. I believe in that. And I'm not the first to say that at all. Uh, there's a group in Arizona called Peyote Way Church. I've known them for many decades, since I was kind of like a snotty-nosed kid running around in the desert looking for peyote. Um, they've been saying this forever. It's, I believe, number 4 in their Articles of Faith, as a matter of fact, which says that the cultivation and care of peyote is a religious devotion, period. And they've been living that. They've been growing it since I was a young man with no gray hair, as much as they could up to this point. They've done pretty well for themselves, having a nice amount of their own homegrown medicine. We can't always say that it's sustainable when we do that, because many of the mother plants in private gardens originally came from Texas. They didn't come from what we would call a truly sustainable source. They were what I call moved sideways. A certain amount of ex situ conservation right now is plants moved sideways. Ones that came from Texas that get replanted in other places. In my case, a lot of my mother plants were ones that were too small to be harvested and sold. And so either myself or somebody else made sure that that plant came somewhere where it could grow to maturity rather than using it in ceremony.
Mhm.
So what we're doing at Morning Star is we're doing our best to create a sustainable source of seeds, first of all. And so we've kind of been just like managing that level of it, but we're hoping that in the near future, people have their own mother plants to keep that cycle going. We're just about there. We're getting there, but not in the numbers that are going to make any difference for anybody else. They're good for us, but we're talking about potentially, hopefully, somebody needing 100,000 seedlings in a few years to plant out on some conservatory grounds. This is what to go back to your question, that is one of our goals, is sustainable population somewhere, and not just for our own consumption or anything like that.
Okay. Right on. And so why is preservation of the peyote cactus so important?
Well, so I think that the least interesting aspect of peyote for me, not changing the subject, same subject, is that it's classified as a psychoactive Schedule One substance here in the States, and has all this legendary rumor, it's like that urban knowledge of peyote. You'll hear people bring it up, like, oh, what are you doing? Smoking peyote, man, or whatever. But I've always said it's like religion, sex, and death or whatever. It's like, the most well-known subjects that people know very little about, and take very little care to distinguish, but will argue and talk about it anyway. Peyote has this weird thing of like everybody knows a little something about it from, oh, I think it's like grows on the tip of a cactus, like, somewhere in Arizona, there's like kind of half-assed knowledge about peyote. But that whole aspect of it is like, oh man, like you eat it and it gets y'all. See, we don't have a good way to talk about altered consciousness in Western US culture, Western Canadian culture, even Mexican, really. It's like it all goes back to the World War II idea of getting messed up on booze. Like the only alteration of consciousness is you're stumbling around, seeing shit and just dumb stuff, like, come on, man. Like, that's not all there is. Like, that's like saying the only thing you can do in water is drown, you know? You can
Mhm.
also learn how to swim, you can jet ski, you can power electricity with it. So we don't have a good way of talking about that. And like that whole aspect of like, oh, it gets you high, whatever that is, I just find it to be the most boring part of the whole thing. The most interesting thing to me is maybe two things, but like the botany and ecology, which I've been talking about. I'm just like a plant dork and I love cacti, like all cacti. So, it's right in my zone. Like it's just that part of it. I'm just like forever. It doesn't change. It only gets more all the time. Like I don't get bored of this thing. I'm just like, what else what,
Yeah.
what can I figure this how does this happen? I'm just amazed by the botany of it. But the other thing is the culture, like the real culture, like the art. Like my house is basically a peyote art gallery, always has been. And most of my stuff is put away and not even out. I've always been fascinated by everybody who gets involved with this seems to end up making some kind of art. Everything from like a tattoo to very traditional like devotional offerings,
Yeah.
gods.
And you had
Uh,
showed me some of your art earlier, if you'd like to
yeah,
show
it's all
that.
around. I do my own, but this is my kind of style these days. I'm doing all this, kind of like Peter Max, ridiculous color yarn on with string and yarn on wax board,
So
which
that's
is
a traditional Huichol art form there.
it's a medium they invented. I have a lot of Weechel art around here too, but I literally learned the craft from them in a Mexican prison. Long story. But while I was there, they're like, hey, buddy, might as well join in on the party and start making your own because I had been buying and selling their yarn paintings for some time. So I ended up just loving the making of it. Yeah, I can't figure out enough ways to make something look like a peyote button out of string or ceramic or clay. It's just like this thing. And plus they're like mandalas. So there's this peyote art culture, which I'm fascinated with. And the internet can get you there real fast. You look up peyote art, you're going to find all kinds of mediums. Like I say, from tattoos to whatever.
Mhm.
Uh, there's sculptures, there's T-shirts, there's just all this peyote art, and I am fascinated by that. There's also music. There's genres of music, peyote music, really, in some ways, because they're not all the same, but the biggest genre is like Native American church ceremonial songs, and they're sung in sets of four. and the staff and the drum go around the teepee all night, and people take their turn and sing or not, but that's what you're doing throughout the night. And so there's people like my beautiful wife who basically collect this, even if it's just in their heads. Like, oh, what? I love that song that you sing. Oh yeah, my grandpa composed it back. Every song has like a story and like some background, some provenance, and sometimes languages. So some tribal affiliation. And there's people that just do that like sports stats. There are people who have the mind for the whole music part of it. And they catalog songs, or they'll be like deadheads and be tapers. And they'll like collect, oh, I got that one, remember that one up there in Steamboat Springs, Colorado, when such and such were all singing after the ceremony and they recorded it. I got that, man. What? Are you kidding me? I heard of that tape. It's like that.
Right on.
So there's that whole, so the importance of saving the species, to me, in terms of the humanity of it, is the humanity of it. Like there's this whole, I mean, most people think of it as a religious churchy thing because it kind of is. The Native American church certainly is. The natives in Mexico that are from its territory, they have their whole mythology, stories, art that go with it, and it's in their culture. The same way with North American tribes. Uh, it's in their culture, it's in their stories, even in their, I guess what you call family lineages. So many of them know the year that peyote came into their family. And ever since then, they've been with this.
Yeah.
So it just seems weird that all this culture can go along with something that's quite literally dwindling from the earth. I guess there's that. So I love the plant, but you could come at it from like, hey, we got to save this culture, man. And to save this culture, we need to save this species. There's a few examples of that. It's like, it's this weird intersection of spirituality and conservation or ecology. It's not that weird, but like it's been less common than it needs to be, I think. We have some examples, like we all know of, like, let's say the Pacific Northwestern tribes, like the federal government allows them to still hunt whales, for example, or whatever it is like that, because it's their cultural tradition.
Yep.
Well, it's now the cultural tradition of a lot of North American tribes. But really, it's been the cultural tradition of Mexican tribes forever.
Yeah.
So I happen to be a Mexican, and I'm very attached to my Huichol or Huirarica people in Mexico, as far as my love for them and my relations with them and their art. Oh my God, I'm on my way down to visit just for the art in just a couple of weeks, because it's one of my favorite things in the world. To go exploring the world of Huichol art is just, it changes over the years. You get to know the different artists. It's a lot like sports for me.
Do they hold like art festivals and stuff like that?
Oh no, it's just in their culture. So if you go to the area where the people are, like, it's not just in the stores, which it is, because local retailers do want to sell their art, but it's also in the people's homes. Like, it's in their temples. It's actually, depending on the city you're in, the town, the area, it's in the public art. It's in the parks. Um, it's part of the culture down there because it's been there forever. It's not like as weird as it is for us in the United States. Oh, peyote, isn't that what Beavis and Butthead got all messed up on their big adventure? See, it's just got these weird aspects to it. Like, it's kind of all culture, I guess you'd say, but there's a devotional culture, is what that's the core for me, is that all this peyote art around my house, and where it's like there's devotion at the root of it.
Yeah.
And like I say, almost every group who gets involved with it ends up making art. They maybe were already making art, but all of a sudden you've got this helper. And the physicality of it on its own seems like art. That's why I can keep making them on these yarn paintings and not get tired of it, because there's always a new way. They're all different, but they're all the
Yeah.
same. So it's like God's mandala.
Yeah, there's almost like a sacred geometry to them.
And then the flower in the middle, oh my God.
Yeah.
And then the fruits coming after, I have thousands of pictures of my mother plants, and almost as much as my kids and grandkids. This is kind of like a confession, but they
Yeah.
know it. Okay. I'm just constantly taking pictures of them. They're all so cute.
Yeah. Yeah, I know how you feel. For sure. So, what are some of the challenges that your organization faces?
Well, there's the ecology, for sure. And that human footprint is not shrinking, it's expanding. That's the biggest thing. Also, the Native American church keeps growing, it's not going away.
Hmm.
There's also other groups other than the Native American church. And there's the popularity of psychedelic medicine, plant medicines, now too, and I'm not saying that's not its own legitimate need, but I'm just saying the root is the traditional people that have relied on this forever and then spreading out from there. That's part of the reason why the Native American church grows, because people know people, all of us. And when somebody, is helped by it, somebody finds their sobriety, somebody meets their new wife and starts a family, somebody takes up an art, it's like, hey, I started attending this Native American church and this is how it helped me. And this is why I keep going. And people notice that. So you can't really turn that off. So there's kind of like an expansion of the need for it, I guess is what I'm talking about here. But there's also our falling way behind on where we need to be in terms of society, like how we can talk about it and what we accept as moral. Like, were we supposed to just say, oh, those Native Americans, they don't have that much, or they don't know that much, so we'll just let them have this peyote and like hope they just, whatever, go dance your little dances. It's almost like we're not intelligent enough yet to speak about what the actual issue is. Like, it's not just some weird romanticized accessory to Indian culture. I mean, it is culture. And native people tend to have more of a reliance on it than any of us, but that's partly just because of history, man. I'm just saying, like, this spread from Mexicans to North Americans. What, does that river stop? It spreads from North Americans to Europeans. That's a fact. There's a lot of European people who participate in ceremonials and have their own ceremonies, and by the way, have their own medicine growing, because depending on where they are, they're probably not prohibited from doing so. I personally know, I just had some visitors here from Estonia that were
Hmm.
just here to come visit with the medicine we have here, and they're starting their own projects there, and they attend ceremonies where the peyote is actually grown on site in various European locations.
Yeah, I
So
know
I guess
UK
what I'm
is
saying is
legal.
history is affecting us right now, okay? And this merging of the expansion of the use with the shrinking of the resource is just freaking me out. So that's a huge challenge in terms of, like, let's just say society, because it's not easy to go to the state of Texas or to the DEA and say, look, you guys just don't get it. They don't want to hear that. I mean, there's a little bit. There's been some hearings held in the past year in Congress with representatives from the Native American Church to like try to get like some conservation conversation going, but it's very stodgy, as you can imagine.
Yeah.
It's like microphone, microphone, microphone. There's not a lot of real knowledge base. So thankfully, there's a few people that are trying to get the conversation primed up a little bit. Um, So we're seeing like the spread of like the knowledge for the need of some kind of alternative is just barely starting to flower right now. Hopefully it'll bear some fruit. So I guess what I'm saying is one of the challenges is the politics and the legal bureaucracy.
For sure.
Some type of exemption provision for salvaging plants that are every day getting scraped out. That to me would be a huge win. And it's been hard for that conversation to get traction, believe it or not. It's hard. It's not easy. It's not just governmental politics. Sometimes it's the people who rely on the medicine themselves. Sometimes it's the people who are trying to do something to conserve it themselves. There's not a lot of agreements on methods. This is why I love my job as cultivation director at Morning Star Conservancy, because I've got this focus, which is real simple. I'm like, hey, you know what? I don't know about all that. Like, it's real hard for me to sit here and be writing letters that's going to change any administrator's mind, right now today.
Yeah.
But today, what I can do is care for these seedlings, and I can do these little transplants, and I can do this and that. That I feel like I'm doing something every day.
Yeah, for
So,
sure.
so the challenge is going to be getting it from that stage to a more long-term stage without some societal change in terms of what is okay in terms of peyote conservation when you're discussing a Schedule 1 substance. Ideally, they take it off Schedule 1. That's kind of obvious. But you see how long they've taken to do that with cannabis. It still hasn't happened. I don't have a
Yeah.
lot of hope that they're just going to change their mind tomorrow or next month or next decade about how they're dealing with peyote as a scary, mind-altering whatever. I it's hard for me to even look at that without getting nauseous, much less trying to fix it.
Yeah.
So there is some societal ideation that's got to change, maybe even consciousness. And maybe that's going to be a side effect of the new psychedelic therapeutic acceptance fad, because it's not new, it's really old. It's been going on here where I live for a long time. Ever
Yeah.
since I was a kid, any single weekend I could drive out to the reservation and see a teepee or two up. And yeah, come on in. And there was never any charge. So I guess I'm just saying, like, uh, through this psychedelic research and whatnot, it's almost like there's a slight normalization of the idea that this has been going on forever, guys. Welcome to the party. Come on in, the teepee's warm.
Yeah.
Something like that. Like,
Yeah.
there's a societal challenge that involves bureaucracy and politics. Bureautics is what I was trying to say.
Yeah. Well, that was actually one of my questions too, is do you think that the US government will ever loosen the laws surrounding the plant?
Well, my best case scenario is my worst case scenario. And that is that some fool, because you really would have to be a fool, decides to take these issues, because it really is several issues here, take them all the way to Supreme Court, where some fool proves that this was never a societal problem, that government has no compelling interest, as they say, because that is the term, that government has no compelling interest in prohibiting conservation of this species on a private and an organizational level. I don't see the federal government doing anything but getting out of the way could help. I also have a fear that them trying to help will make it worse, because we've seen that happen at least a couple of times. so, so I'm kind of weird that way. I'm like, well, I'm not sure. It's good that you're talking about giving $5 million, $10 million, whatever it may be, to peyote conservation, but what does that mean to you? Because to some people, that means you start copping down. And I mean that literally, with cops from the Department of Justice, to make sure that nobody without a tribal card can go to a religious worship ceremony. Now, to me, that just sounds freaky right off the top.
Mhm.
And guess what? It does not really save any peyote anywhere in the world, and does not address the actual problem. But honestly, there are people who think that's where part of that money ought to go, under the ostensibly under the guise of protecting it because it's rare, so we don't need these white people wasting it. And I say that in kind of a crappy way because it really is a crappy way to think, in my opinion. Uh, what would do the most good is you figure out a way of paying somebody off with some of this cash to not scrape with bulldozers, or buying some land to go in front of those bulldozers and move those plants, or buying some lawyers to change the law so that you can do that legally. Like, I don't know where to start here, but I'm saying I don't think money is really the big issue. And so it's more like that societal change where somebody's got to say, look, all these other cacti are endangered. If I go start pulling out saguaros around here, I'm going to have the cops on me really fast. There are saguaro trucks that we'll see driving around here that relocate saguaro. They have a way of doing it. There's a hinged holder on the back of the truck so that they can take the saguaro out upright and lay it down and move it off in this truck. Well, those things, we see them driving around, but those plants have to have their tags on them or it's contraband.
Really? Yeah.
Yeah, and so peyote doesn't even have that protection in many ways. I mean, technically it does, but in reality, no. Everybody, like I say, who needs some beer money can just cut a fence, hop out on whatever private land where it still may be, because if it's there, it's about to not be, because it's getting transferred into money just a few hours later. It's sad. It really is sad. And I don't know how I got there. I forget what you actually asked me, but that's where I end up. Like, that is the reality of today. That is, so I guess what I'd love to say, because it's so true, that when you look at the reality on the ground, which most of us don't, so ignorance is bliss, but you actually go there, you spend time there, you know the people there that have been there forever. You have human smuggling, drug traffic, drug interdiction, coyotes charging people, people dying in the desert, people getting banditoed, and banditos who bandito them, and all kinds of mean and ugly and horrible things that are going on. And the harvest of our sacrament is right in the middle of that, including the human trafficking aspect of it, where people who don't want to be cutting this peyote are being made to cut this peyote to bring it in because it's the hardest work in the world. That is no longer an honorable way to procure our sacrament, is all I'm saying. It's not. And it's clearly not sustainable. That's not even an argument.
Yeah.
But the honor of it, I'm just saying, it's affecting us as a church. It really is. Like, we really need to look at it and say, honestly, where's our sacrament coming from? How is it getting here? In the traditional way, you go and you pray and you harvest that way and you take what you need and like all that. But of course, money gets into it and whatever.
Yeah.
The Huichol people in Mexico, they still make the offerings and all that. So it still is what you might call sustainable. But in their fields, in their lands down there, there's a lot of land degradation. There's a lot of peyote tourism, but mostly there's land clearing, just as in South Texas. Down there, it's more for tomato and chili pepper greenhouses that are like cartel oriented or funded, and they're clearing out land for all this production on cheap land, and they're scraping out the peyote. So even the Huichol, who do make the offerings and make the prayers and do the collecting, their whole scene is totally threatened as well for different reasons. Well, for the same reasons, but they haven't monetize their sacrament. They still actually go out and pick it. And so they do see what's going on out there. They do see the damage. They understand what is actually happening on the ground.
Yeah. So do you believe the peyote population is still in decline, or do you believe maybe it's getting better? And where do you kind of see it in 5 to 10 years?
I really believe that in 5 to 10 years, that 2 or 3 licensed dealers won't even be in business. I don't see how they could be. Unfortunately, the reality is that I hate to say it because it makes me sound like I'm like telling on somebody or telling tales out of school, but you know what? It's being smuggled from Mexico. Everybody knows it. And sometimes that enters the legal marketplace. So in other words, it's disguised as Texas medicine, but it's not, and then it's sold. Or it's just distributed directly by whoever brought it across or paid somebody to bring it across, or it gets around, and it does exist here north of the border, actual Mexican peyote. Um, so that's not cool, but I guess it's also necessary. That's like a weird one, you know? I'm like, okay, so you guys are using this in ceremony, but you can have this like unclear path of where it came from to get to you, or it's clear to you, but nobody's really saying anything about it. And it's technically illegal for what it's worth. Um, and so that's a huge issue. What was the question specifically? I'm sorry, because I went
Oh,
back
just
there.
whether you thought the population of peyote
Oh,
is
right,
still in decline or
right.
if it's getting better.
I
And
feel like it's generally accepted like it's in decline for those reasons because even the Mexican populations are in decline. It's generally accepted. But it's got a wide area in Texas. It's a big area, and a lot of them are still untouched. So technically, it's not endangered. It's merely threatened, dependent on locality. The most threatened area is apparently uh, that commercial zone in South Texas where it's legally harvested, although that's another thing. Most of it isn't even legally harvested there because so much of it is from fence jumpers who didn't have permission from landowners. That's part of the deal is the landowners lease the land to pickers, but there's so little land from cooperative landowners with peyote left on it that they just jump fences now because they have to still harvest it. So but, but, like I say, I'm a reformed hippie and I still carry a lot of my, mystical beliefs about this plant, which is not necessarily not accurate. Sorry.
oh, it's all good.
Sorry about that. And I do believe that perhaps it hides because we've all seen it hide. Anybody who's hunted peyote in the traditional way will know that's after you find and eat the first one and make those prayers that they start coming out like stars. And suddenly, even where you couldn't see them before, they exist now. Um, and that is, I mean, it sounds a little woo woo, but really ask anybody who's done it, and it's not. I talk to my brothers and sisters in the teepee oftentimes my elders, and they'll say the same thing. Yeah, this peyote comes out when you're the right way with it, And so all of a sudden it'll show itself to you, or you can know where it is, or you can taste it, or you can smell it in the wind. We have this belief. So on my more optimistic days, I think to myself, you know what? It's out there. It just knows how to hide. And maybe one of the things it does is it makes people believe, oh, this area is all picked out so that people don't go back there anymore. I think some of that is actually so. I do believe that, well, I know that there are large areas in South Texas that used to be commercially harvested, but they were all picked out. And so it's not a known thing there anymore. And possibly, hopefully, God willing, there's areas where it used to be harvested where nobody looks for it anymore, where there are self-seeding populations. I like to believe that. I don't have proof, but I do have proof that there are small populations scattered around the place in former healthier areas. So
Yeah.
maybe not within our lifetimes, but potentially down the road, some overly harvested areas could repopulate themselves. But we're applying a lot of pressure, and we're just looking at ways of relieving a little bit of that pressure. The way I like to see it, if you could possibly grow 100,000 sustainably grown plants from seed for Native American church use, that is technically not just 100,000 plants that you didn't have to pull from the desert, but it could be 1 million because, like I say, if they're of the right size, the mass is such that maybe you're saving 10 small ones that were going to get harvested for the same people to eat. So
Yeah.
I just look at it hopefully like that, like
Mm.
like actual sustainable medicine saves more than a 1-to-1 ratio of wild plants. It could save 1-to-3, 1-to-5, if you do it right.
Yeah.
So that's one way I'd like to think we can relieve some pressure. But right now, to answer your question, I think like the wave is probably against us. Like there's probably less peyote in this world every year than the year before, except in a lot of European countries, like I say, and not just European, but like Taiwan, Thailand. There's people who are really getting the love of growing peyote as I see online. It's just a thing. So
Yeah.
there is that too. Almost like as an offset, maybe, to what's
Yeah.
going on in its natural habitat.
Yeah.
I guess you would consider that ex situ conservation, like not in location. But maybe it's commercially driven too, and that's a whole other thing. Some people hate that, some people don't care. The way I see it, plants have their own wisdom to figure out a way to get around and survive. They might even use us to do it, just like tulips, is the legendary one, right? Or
Yeah.
or like, apples or cannabis or like uh noxious plants too, ones that will just hitchhike into territories where they probably shouldn't be growing. Plants find a way, basically.
Yeah.
And maybe all this interest in people cultivating, maybe I just hold out the idea that that's actually maybe peyote doing its thing. That's how much of a hippie I used to be, and maybe still am. I really do believe it has its own intelligence that way. So
Yeah.
call me simple, but
Maybe it's
I
all part
kind
of
of
the
see it
plan.
working with me like that. It's like, dude, here's why you love to grow us, because we want you to love to grow us.
Yeah.
You know, you're making more of us. Thank you in a way,
Yeah.
you know.
For
I
sure.
feel that from it.
Yeah. So how can people help your organization?
Well, this whole idea of like, let's just get the idea of what the reality is. I think that's really important. That doesn't, take anything more than like, so actually, I'm kind of lucky. Like, I'll tune into a radio show or a podcast, and I'll kind of like randomly, it seems like, have a disproportionate amount of times where I'll hear somebody mention peyote. It's just this weird thing I've noticed throughout my life, because how it is kind of in pop culture a little bit. So just a couple of days ago, I was listening to a random podcast, and all of a sudden they're like, "Yeah, what about that peyote? Do the Comanche use that, or no? They're too far north," and people like were kind of bringing it up. And I started thinking, well, like I say, everybody knows something about it, but like these guys who were talking about it on this podcast, they expressed an interest in what it is, la la la. But guess what? They don't know. They don't know like that it's totally threatened. Like what I'm seeing is that the people who know are the ones going, hey, where could I get some seed? What's the deal with this? Like, how do you grow it? Like, they're the ones who do a little bit of investigation. So I like that. That's why I think podcasts are good for one thing. I'm trying to get around a little bit more and be the Peyote Lorax. That's what I call myself for fun. And that way I can play the character that I am and not have to take it personally, kind of, because I get all fired up about it. And that's that whole children's story of like somebody's got to speak for the trees, man. Like you're chopping them all down over here. So I got that in me. I'm just like, well, I do want to say that it's important to know that this thing that, Beavis and Butthead found in the desert, it ain't growing there anymore. Okay, guys, this is getting really hard to get for the people who use it for medicine, who pray with it, who depend on their healing. We see healing from this ceremony, from this plant in this ceremony. And that's amazing. Like, come on. So I'm just like, this is not something that we can just keep buying through the mail, guys. It doesn't just come around in this bowl in the teepee. It came from somewhere. There was a seed way back in the day, and then somebody had to find it and harvest it and bring it to you. I mean, let's take care of that. Um, that's what I see as having to happen first. From that, you know, it won't be seen as a bad thing to be an advocate for it. Uh, you won't be suspect of having something to do with drugs, you know. Uh, then people might feel comfortable contributing their time, their money, their resources, their talents to making sure that certain organizations can exist and survive and hopefully succeed. That is actually where we're at right now. Um, I don't really consider us the front of the wave either. I consider that to be our elders who got us here. We have elders that are our spiritual advisors to this project. And we just feel like we're following what they did. They had a certain amount of courage. They went ahead and stood up and said, no, this is something we're doing. What do we have to do here? All right, let's organize a chapter so we can, you know, and we can go down and get this plant where it grows, or we can order it through the mail. We can have our ceremony. They had to have they had to get their act together that much. So, so they preceded us and they taught us how to be with this peyote. So I feel like maybe behind us. Maybe we're now the middle of this wave where people have to come in and go, you know what? Maybe I didn't grow up in the Southwest where there's teepees all over. Maybe I've never used this peyote before. But this seems like something like I like to think of it as baby seals without those puppy dog eyes. You know, it doesn't have its own voice. It's not a well-known thing. Like, dude, I thought it was fine. I thought it grows all over New Mexico. People say this, you know.
I hear that a
No,
lot. Yeah. Oh, you
it
can find
doesn't.
that all over this place or that
No.
place. And yeah.
So I guess what I'm saying is like that idea needs to be a known thing. We need to talk about it. The Gen Zers or whoever's coming up behind, you know, I'd like to see that they have the option someday maybe of going in a teepee. Maybe they're going to need it. Maybe they're going to meet their partner there. Maybe they're going to have a family. That's what I see happening. I know people all over this country, young families met each other in the teepee, came to it because they needed help with their sobriety, or a friend invited them to their ceremony that they had for their sobriety. You know, families are made this way. So I feel like it's important to know that this culture begins with a seed, I guess, and somebody needs to start doing something about it. Um, Everybody bother Elon Musk. Uh, Send him our URL. It's morningstarconservancy.org. That's a start. I have my own little blog where I nerd out, which is the peyotelorax.com. You can find me on the Instagram simply because all my peyote pictures, I need some place to put them. So there they are up there. I'm the Peyote Lorax on Instagram. There's other organizations you should look it up. There's the Cactus Conservation Institute to focus on the actual land itself and the production of the associated species. That's cactusconservation.org, I believe, cci.org possibly. Look it up. There's the IPCI in South Texas, which has their own Native American Church chapter based oriented conservation program on some acreage down there, ipci.life, I believe. Um, there's, I believe, who is called Sacred, SACRD. Each of these groups has their own approach, I would say. There's a couple of others, not to really purposefully leave anybody out, but I work with and for Morning Star Conservancy because I really believe that they are the most ecumenical, broad spectrum, goal oriented group that I can see to apply myself with at this time. It's because we're looking down the road, starting in 3 years of having plantable rootstock for people, whether it's Cheyenne Arapaho in Oklahoma, or whether it's somebody, some Native American church group in Oregon, or possibly in Maine, Southern California. These are all areas that we know people in who have expressed deep interest. So that's the purpose for the upcoming startup of workshops to be given. So there's actual hands-on, quite actual physical information transferred on the potential for, let's just say, the minimum goal being a teepee ground, which is what we call it when there's a place, usually a private home, where somebody hosts teepee ceremonies at their property. One of these teepee grounds can provide itself their sacrament in 8 to 10 years realistically. And it kind of almost doesn't matter where they are. It's happening in Canada. And so I'm just saying, this pilot project program needs to expand out a little bit. So people who have interest in that, in Canada, I guess your genetic, I guess we'd call it, or your religious affiliation isn't so much of an issue. You should check into your own conservation at your own home or your own community area, however it works for you. In the United States, you need to check in and see what you can do through the auspices of a local Native American church group if you really want to do it in a way that protects your right to do so. That's my understanding of it. Or, like I say, Morning Star Conservancy. We're here to help too. We're also directing people's generosity towards this meaningful project of creating seed stock for the future. And we've already had the cooperation of a lot of individuals and several other organizations in getting things going. We're kind of like a group of organizations, as a matter of fact. One of them in particular, based in Mexico, we're working with them to see what we can help them do down there, what they can help us do up here for the same species, just different situations. So that's what I encourage you to do, is at least educate yourself, and morningstarconservancy.org will have a good way of you getting different resources, actually, from the ecological to the cultural to the specific, being our seedling sanctuary project here. Appreciate you guys checking it out too, people from anywhere. We have a lot of European interests. We have visitors that are hoping to start something up where they live. And like I say, I sometimes don't even understand it. I'm like, how did this happen to you? You're from Bulgaria, okay, let's just say, and you have this interest in peyote too. It's almost like the plant called you. So I'm not the one to decide who can do something, but I do suggest that everybody do if they are called to. That's the way I feel.
Right on. Well, thank you for being here, and it was a pleasure speaking with you. And yeah, I hope to talk to you again soon.
Well, thanks for having me. It's fun talking to you. Anytime you want to call and chat, I'm here too.
Okay, for sure. Yeah, maybe we'll do something like this again in the future. And yeah, I appreciate it.
I'm
Thank you very
interested.
much.
I'm interested in what you're doing up Canada way too. We should talk about that some more.
Okay, sure. Yeah, that'd be interesting for sure.
All right. All right.
Okay,
Good. Well, thank you. Appreciate it.
thank you.
All right.
Take care.
You.